Thank you everyone for being here. So nice to have you join us for the last day of Dancing in the Firmament, Chris Daharsh's first solo show. Exciting moment. Really grateful to have both of these incredible people. It's actually probably the most exciting panel I think that we've organized here at the gallery. Sarah Schlesinger, did I say that right?
Good enough.
It's great. If you haven't already seen her work, please check it out. I just discovered this artist. I think there's such resonance with Chris's work, and very excited to just hear this discussion. And then, of course, Andrew Woolbright. Bio is a little bit too long for me to repeat.
No.
Artist, editor.
Human.
Human, really?
No, human,
Oh,
just
human.
person.
Human.
Yeah, human being. We
From
just
the
have to stick
Midwest,
with
that
human
I've
being.
learned.
Yes, yeah. Illinoisan.
Illinoisian. Thank you so much for being here, and yeah, very excited for the talk.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, cool. Let's get into it because there's so much that I'm really excited to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm excited to get to just pitch both of you questions about this wonderful show, but I think really relevant to our time. A lot of issues coming up in this work and Sarah in your work, which is like, what does it mean to have a relationship to the environment? But maybe just to get started off, I've been really interested in morphology lately, like just getting into definitions, like what it means to try to define. And I'd imagine both of you have very different definitions of what a landscape is to you. And I'd be interested, I think that comes through in your work very clearly, but I'd love to hear you both talk about like what is a landscape. Maybe starting off with you, Chris.
Yeah, I think that I've like connected with the landscape in different ways, in different parts of my, artistic experience, but I think that for this show especially, I'm thinking of a broader term for landscape where like it's not a definition that is strictly a natural landscape. It's the man-made, it's the trash heap, it's the psychological implications of the landscape, of me viewing it and other people viewing it, that kind of creep in. So I think of the landscape as this sort of metastasizing moment, either in my mind or in a moment just captured as a snapshot. So it kind of oscillates.
Cool. Scrap heap, snapshot. These are already great words to start off. Sarah, what about you? How would you define a landscape?
I think of it very much as like a format with, like it's a view. A landscape is a view into the distance. So there's a foreground, middle ground, and distance, and there's usually a division of land and sky in some way. So I'm really thinking about landscape as like a metaphor for perspective, like how far can you see, what can you see, what is being presented to you. So I always have just like the idea of what's in front and what's in the distance, like close and far, kind of in my mind.
Well, I think something that I think is really interesting about both your practices is just maybe it's funny to someone else, maybe it's not, but just two New York artists working in the city that are both interested in landscape, while there is landscape here in the city and wonderful flora and fauna such as rats and little trees here and there. You're both kind of painting things or dealing with subject matter that's at a bit of a distance. And I wonder how both of you deal with that. Like, is alienation something that you're both thinking about, or mediation, or like how do you close the gap, starting with you, Chris, of like getting into like approaching this thing that is, at least a train ride away or a car trip upstate or wherever, and like, can we also talk about process maybe, like how you're remembering these things or documenting it, bringing it back into the studio? So it's a lot of questions, but are these about alienation? Are they about mediation? And what's your process, Chris?
Yeah, I think it's about mediation for me. I think that, the process that a lot of these came from was a collection of literal snapshots, either of digital or analog photography, black and white or color, I've been liking the analog photography as like a beginning point or like a start even before I begin to draw or sketch, as a way to like capture atmosphere. It does well to, I don't know, I like the analog. It somehow is already more physical to me. And that little like memento or keepsake kind of fuels these other things. So then I take them into the drawings and the process of that abstraction through that. Some are more traditionally abstracted than the others. Some are more just moments of what I'm experiencing and me wanting to hold on to them and to almost protect them. But then there's moments where I want to obliterate the landscape and sort of like, you know, fast track it into this like realm of anxiety and yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, well, is that like fast track? Is that relationship based on a certain relationship to the photography? I mean, like some of these paintings get almost like an alla prima outdoor painting. They feel like pretty close to the way you would think of a landscape, and then obviously there's the swarm or the shimmer or the pile. Is there like a distance of memory between how you choose to make one or the other? Is like one related to like a analog material image and one is digital, or like how does it inform when you kind of stay close to the landscape and maybe get further away in some of these really wonderful ones? Yeah,
I think that the more swarmy ones that I'm describing as more abstract tend to my mediation, the more that I remove them from their original state or their original memory, kind of it begins to build, and that swarm or that like the waves and the churning and the roiling sort of energy can get imbued into the image. Whereas the ones that are more straight up landscape are me wanting to like not let go of these experiences, but they're more often the ones that skew that way. Alla prima, like sort of like more traditional landscapes or recognizable landscapes. I use less photography, so there's more about the experience.
Is it a relationship to time too? Like, is it like more time in the landscape with a painting like that versus maybe a quicker glance or having to capture it and apprehend as an image? Yeah.
I think so, yeah. And we've talked a little bit about time too, and I think that snapshot, and me focusing more on interior with these rather than, with these I was sitting in a park for 2 hours. Not painting them and not drawing them, but just experiencing them and eating lunch or something.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sarah, what about you? I mean, like, even the way you describe the landscape, like foreground, middle ground, background, is like a type of image or imaging of it. But like, how images inform your landscape and alienation? Does it play a role, or is it something that you're getting closer to as you make your paintings?
Yeah, I don't use any reference material except I do plein air paint sometimes. I've done a lot of plein air painting at my parents' house in their yard, and they have a very conical looking bush tree that I've painted a lot. So there is like a mental reference book of just things that I've painted over and over. But I'm not thinking of, we kind of talked about as like your landscapes act almost as portraits or like embodiments or, your vision of this experience or moment, and mine are more metaphorical. So I'm not really thinking of a specific time except for like a made up time. And then alienation. There's definitely, I have a lot of like gardens, so there's a lot of boundaries, private space, public space, so I think that's in there. But as far as like man alienated from nature, it's not the angle that I'm coming at, but but I love for any interpretation that comes.
Cool. Well, it's interesting that you start with the garden, which has like a lot of writing in art history, specifically with like beauty versus the picturesque. You know, like the garden of the courtyard is very beautiful. It's ordered. It's taking nature and making it into something symmetrical and like approachable and understandable. And then there's the idea of the picturesque, which is like the love of the weird shaped rock and like the jagged edges, maybe more like kind of the jaggedness you see. How do you both kind of navigate, again, getting into definitions, like your relationship of work to, you know, natural beauty, and you're trying to contain it with your practice versus the picturesque and like the love of that jagged edge, maybe. Chris?
Yeah, I think that the love of the jagged edge, yeah, definitely crops up in my mind, and like these like trying to find beauty in places where it's not often wanting to be found or not often being searched for, or I guess in that way it skews towards the picturesque and more like I don't know, finding these moments where I can be surprised by something that I come across, and trying to locate those, like pinpoint those moments of like, you know, light dappling through a tree, and you know, these little snapshots, I guess. Yeah.
Well, I love how you described that the one on the left here is like the one on the right is the way the light might shine through the branches and the leaves of the one on the left, like the two form a diptych or a relationship of shadow and light versus like the thing itself. It's like really nice. I mean, but I also feel like within your like really layered, you know, like the roiling forms, that's like maybe, I don't know what that is, like more, there is like that repetition is a type of idea of beauty, but it's like a dark, you know, kind of zombie or like dark ecology beauty, you know, like you have, but maybe that's the picturesque as well. But I feel like you're kind of maybe navigating both at different times, which I really appreciate when you come back to. But Sarah, what about you? Like I feel like that the garden is maybe more of the thing you're thinking of.
Yeah, this comes into a bit of a process question, but very purposeful. I like compositions, so I think that fits well with the garden. I guess the more ordered, the beautiful side of that. But I'm not intentionally kind of referencing like a hierarchy of beauty or nature, greenery, plants. I'm just sort of using it as a format and a space. So I'm a little bit removed from you know, looking at something and appreciating and wanting to encapsulate it in some way. It's more about I came to the landscape with like kind of a big thought of time, like Garden of Eden sort of creation myth, like big picture time. So I am thinking about time, just like bigger time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe that's a good segue into, Garden of Eden and the title of this show, The Firmament, both kind of get into spiritual language, or at the very least, like mystical language. I wonder how both of you would describe those terms or define those terms. You know, like, I think mysticism means a lot of things for people, or spiritualism or animism. Those are all different isms, but like, is there one that feels closer to you in your work? And like, how would you define that for yourself, maybe?
I think for me, like I absorb all of them in my practice, right? But in different ways. Like I think that mysticism implies to me like an organization of ritual, sort of, and like a more organizing of the spiritual, right? Behind belief systems. And so like for me, the ritual is like going out on a hike taking pictures, you know, doing sketches in the park, or just eating lunch in the park. And so those rituals like build on themselves into my own sort of mysticism, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then the animism and the spirituality sort of come into play. I mean, especially most directly in the sculptures at first, because I sort of moved from the sculptures back to the paintings. I was doing more sculpture a few years ago, and I think that like that animism and wanting to imbue every object with like a similar sense of like democratic or
Yeah.
worth in some way,
Yeah.
and wanting to see that spirit in everything, even though I'm not organized in a religion
Yeah.
way.
Right. But it's like maybe a material religion or a material animism. Yeah.
It's storytelling for my own brain too. It's just like it's telling myself or seeing stories and things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, since we're on that, and Sarah, I want to ask you about that religious thing, but since we're on this sculpture, I mean, like I do love how animated this thing becomes, like with the shells, and like anytime I see like, especially like a snail shell, I think of like the slime and that kind of like vital thing left behind, you know, and then you take all of that and it's like a dead tree at the end of it, or a dead coral reef that's becoming a body, and you like think of different forms like a foot or something. And I wonder, I mean, like, are you thinking about your paintings as a type of body in a landscape or a figural way? Like, how does that relate to this, which feels very much like a gestural body?
Mm-hmm. I think often the more mediated I have, the more mediation done in the work. So like the more abstracted they get, the more like sort of roiling, wavy tendencies they have. I think I do see those as like sort of resurrecting these like snail shells, or like, you know, they become these like ecological but also bodily moments. Especially that one, but all of them are I do think of as living as tissue, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I want to pick up on that, but I also want to make sure, Sarah, you get a chance to talk about that mysticism and this too. But we can go back.
I would say at this moment, I'm less. I mean, I do think of my like hedges and trees as characters, kind of, but when I started doing landscapes, they were kind of bird's eye view, and I was interested in divisions in the land and boundaries, property lines, and then I kind of like sunk in and focused on the boundaries themselves, and then they became characters with kind of personality. So I definitely have had that, like, I mean, there's so many different ways to approach the landscape. So at this moment, I'm not thinking that, but they do look, when people see my hedges, they talk about them like they have personalities. So I think that I do think of them as living.
Well, I think that like personification of the landscape is really interesting, and something that I admire about both of your practices is I get really exhausted by the way the landscape is oftentimes talked about and used within art. Like it can become this like kind of terra faith, you know, nature's good, Mother Nature, like what are we doing to it? We're harming it, her, you know. It deals with it in a very hegemonic way, and oftentimes like a moralizing way. And like there's so much complexity in the show, Chris, and also Sarah, in your work, to the way that you handle nature. There's like a terrifying kind of uncanniness to it, like that those roots almost become like an octopus or something writhing towards you under the water. But then there's also like moments where it's more like Klimt, you know, it's more like just like I want to see this tree the way I first maybe would have seen it you know, outside of everything. So it's like, there's not a singular approach to something being, you know, I love nature, I hate nature, nature good, nature bad. It seems like you're really stepping outside of style and accommodating it in all the really complex ways it can be. But like, I wonder how you both treat that. Like, I mean, do you have to personify it when you approach it, where you're like, I really am attached to this tree, or this thing is like kind of revolting to me for the subject shifts or the style shifts?
I think yeah, I think I do have to sort of attach myself and see myself in these individual moments, and there are the moments, yeah, where I'm like maybe a more Klimt mindset of landscape, where I am like, this is just really nice, and I need to take a moment, as we all do, to like meditate and like stop for a second. And then there are these very like sudden swings into anxiety and into wanting to personify it even more, until it becomes this like almost like metastasizing flesh. It becomes this like Akira-esque monster, or it becomes something in between where it's like, you know, not terrifying and not soothing, you know, where it's like it's in between, or it's complex, it's a gradient, it's a spectrum.
Yeah. Sarah, what about you? How are you thinking of that landscape as fiction in your approach, and how you attribute a style to it, or like a form to it?
I'm coming at it very much from like a compositional, like I'm starting with, you know, like a drawing that is with the idea of the distance, the sky being the future, being able to see what's ahead, being the eternal, celestial, and then I'm kind of always just like constructing something to block that view. So mine is very compositional, how I'm coming up. I'm using hedges because they are hedges, and you can make any shape and color with them. You can kind of do anything you want with them. So it's coming more from like a practical, like this format works for what I'm thinking about. Yeah.
I mean, so like the way you're describing the hedge and the celestial, I feel like Albert Pinkham Ryder is someone that both of you, I'd imagine, are interested in, but maybe for totally opposite reasons. Like the darkness, Sarah, that you use is like kind of tonalist maybe era, and Chris, I feel like when he really starts to kind of get into fabulation and like these writhing forms. But I wonder like what an artist like that means to both of you, or how you think about him in relationship to your work, or like Arthur Dove or any other landscape painter, whatever we're saying. Outdoorsy
people.
Yeah. The world,
people who take hikes.
The world painters. It's so tricky to even talk about this, but you know what I mean. Y'all know what I mean. Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, I think I can take a little bit from each, right? It's like I can kind of pick and choose. I think some of them can skew very utopian, like we said, about thinking of like nature as this monolithic thing and we're not a part of it, or we're somehow separated. But I think I tend to enjoy the painters that more get into the nuance of it, like Ryder, like Dove, like Birchfield, and others who like can see dark moments, but also maybe a little bit more of the mystical or the spiritual animism in some way.
Yeah. Sarah?
Yeah, I love Ryder's work. Everything, landscape is such a good format for trying to express how you see the world and your place in the world, and like Ryder often has like a little boat or a little horse or whatever, so there's this human kind of presence, like traveling or
Almost like an anchor, sort
yeah,
of. Yeah.
there's like a place and they're lost or they're speeding somewhere. So that, I mean, those are, I feel like, very, like, get to your heart. Yeah, but neither of us really have any people. You have the man-made involved, but not super, I mean,
I think
Yeah.
the most like man-made or like reference to people is maybe like the one with the little cars over there. But
Yeah.
the forms.
but human contact is like
Yeah.
very much in there,
Mhm.
in my gardens for sure.
Yeah, I love the hedges as an object or like a focus for you because it's like, it's this barrier, but it's also nature.
Yeah, it's nature. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's been sculpted and created very intentionally, but it's living and growing. It has a will.
It's to do very
Yeah.
unnatural things,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
to speak.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, maybe that would be productive, which is like Chris, if you're animating a body and giving nature a body and feet and arms and legs and an ability to kind of walk on its own, is it like, what's the tone of that for you? Is it something that like it makes us filled with shame when we see it, or is it something that like it triggers the uncanny or the repulsion, or like, what are you thinking about this animated nature thing, and how are we supposed to feel about it?
Yeah, I think both. Yeah, I mean, shame and uncanny are two, sort of descriptors that I think about with what I want to see in them, right? Or when I'm like making them. And when I make the sculptures, my table usually just ends up being this like mass of like pile of casts and objects and colors and I mean, I went kind of more silhouette with these colors, but I think that I want people to see what they see in it, of course. I'm not trying to be prescriptive, but I see shame. I see me wanting to sort of reanimate a corpse of this mashup of the man-made and the natural and what we think of in those categories, and melding the two.
Well, I'm sorry if this is hack or cliche or well-known. I don't know the level of known, but I mean, I always think it come back to and find it interesting that, unheimlich, uncanny, the German word for that, the Heimat, is also the word for land and home. Like unheimlich has a relationship to a loss of home and a loss of land. Like it's a destabilizing of seeing, I can't find nature that makes the whole world turn into this dark imaginary that you want to reject. And I feel like there's something about that's really interesting of Heimat turning into unheimlich in your work, of the nature is dispossessed of its vitality, and is now the corpse that is animated to make us all destabilized, maybe, which is very cool.
Yeah, and I like that loss of perspective, or like that like perceived loss of like, where is my place? Where can I see myself or not see myself in this landscape? Maybe. Yeah.
Well, Sarah, like maybe I've never gotten a chance to talk to you about it, but your paintings are so richly dark, beautifully painted, but then it is like the hedge, or like the garden hedge of like something that implies protection, but then there's that shadow world to it. Is it a confining space that you're thinking about, a big inside of the hedge, or like, how are you kind of internalizing that paint?
I think first and foremost, it's like a blockade to what's beyond. And the darkness is also like a blockade. Like you just can't see it. Not being able to see is something I'm interested in. This is how I feel in life. But then I am creating these like private spaces, and I do think about like, is it a protected zone or is it a prison? Like, that is always, you know, on my mind,
Hmm. Hmm.
which could be, is the garden, you know, I'm not really thinking about, the garden as far as like human gardening and wilderness and like, you know, wild nature and manicured nature, but those work well as like a contrast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in your work, I like how the edge of the garden kind of almost is more like an eclipse, or it's like the edge of the earth or something, or it's like one light breaking to a shadow or vice versa. Like I don't know, yeah, it feels like more of like a natural event rather than thought of maybe in terms of like closed off or, for me, but yeah.
I like that.
I mean, something, I pulled a quote that I'll read real quick, because the other thing is I do think there's something defensive, confrontational potentially, or at least something that, a subjectivity that can stand on its own two legs in both of your works. And it reminds me of the way Antonin Artaud talked about in The Mountain of Signs. Artaud famously lost his mind visiting the Sahara, or visiting the desert, staring at the mountain, took peyote and saw that everything was repeating, and wrote about it very beautifully. But a lot of people attribute that to like the break in psyche with him. But I was reading this and I was like, this could have been said about some of your work, Chris. You're not going crazy. That's not. I'll do the thing. I'll pull. Yeah. This music, which reduces material chaos to its prime elements, explains by a kind of grandiose mark how nature orders and directs the birth of forms she brings forth out of chaos. And all I beheld seemed governed by a number such as 3, 4, 7, or 8, which kept recurring. Now this inhabited Sierra, which breathes a metaphysical system into its rocks, has been strewn by the Tarahara with signs which are perfectly conscious, intelligent, and concerned. I think that like something psychedelic and hallucinogenic can happen when looking at nature, seeing that infinite repetition, of seeing the golden ratio, of seeing these things perpetuating, that I think can easily become a type of terror, like a type of like a super ordering of the world. And I think that I don't know how that definition feels to either of you, but I can see that kind of happening in some of these roiling, swirling, fragmented forms in your work, but also the way of closing off space in here, Sarah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for my work, I tend to, when I'm in nature, see those patterns and get the terror, you know.
Yeah.
I like, maybe not going crazy yet, but
Right.
like later on maybe,
Yeah.
but like, it's arresting, right? It's like
Yeah.
very like, you notice these fractals, you notice these like endless patterns or endless amounts of variation in the pattern even, and I think that's kind of like a starting point for a certain type of anxiety through the landscape or whatever. But yeah, so I'm into that interpretation or that angle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, I didn't finish the thought. I don't think you're going crazy, but like I do think that, you know, Artaud was also blending the landscape with Kabbalah, and like I think it's very interesting your interest in metal music, like the drone or the rhythm. Like I feel like that's maybe more of your Kabbalistic interest in rhythm and repetition. Like maybe these are, instead of the religious, well, although there is spiritualism in it, but maybe it's more of like your Artaud Kabbalistic idea of numerology is accessed more through dark metal, Tool, different bands like that.
Yeah, I think there's like there's a swapping of ritual and meditation and numbers and prog rock sequences and stuff like that I definitely resonate with, and like that sort of brush with something that's perceivably more complex than you,
Mhm.
or imperceivably more complex than you rather.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'm into that. I'm into that.
Cool. Sarah, what about you?
I don't think I come at it from that angle.
Cool.
Yeah. But
What
I-
angle are you thinking about?
Well, maybe the closest thing of like, I think just because I'm not really thinking about nature in my landscapes, I'm just using it as a way to talk about what you can see.
Mhm.
But when I started, I was thinking about like I grew up between Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, and both very colonial impacted landscapes that were clear cut for sheep upon European arrival and whatever. So and everything's very kind of like ordered and cute and mown.
Mhm.
So, but there, you know, you feel nothing wants to be that way. Like
Mhm.
everything's, my dad's always chopping trees down, like,
Yeah.
and so I think that there is a feeling of like something trying to like go back to what it was, and that speaks to like the people, colonial, you know, clear cutting of humans and clear cutting of trees. There's a dark kind of aliveness in the ground when you're trying to like force it into a shape.
Right.
But
That's interesting.
There's a history of like people imitating aristocracy from Europe who had these very
it's these European
hyper-
landscapes that were just like,
Yeah.
let's put this on top of this. Yeah.
Like, I want to be a noble from Europe. Let's just like manicure a lawn.
Yeah.
And there's these practices that persist.
Yeah, and military like cul-de-sacs and like these are, you know, not nice.
Yeah. Well, I love that.
Yeah.
Sort of people.
Well, I love thinking about how you put that, like the repression of the biological world, or like constantly cutting down and letting it grow back is like a repression of nature, or like it's repressing something that's going to unfurl or grow in strange ways, or if it doesn't grow, it grows in us maybe, like that strange, like what is this constant cutting down doing? Yeah. Huh. Is there, I mean, there's gotta be, well, I don't know, that's not a good question to ask, like are you repressing anything? We can't know that.
Sometimes I can't do that. Yeah.
But I feel like there is repression, but that's a lot to try to answer
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
what you're repressing.
I definitely feel for that subject, and I think that mindset of like not wanting to be aiding and abetting to that sort of world.
Yeah.
Maybe more through my rituals of like going out, hiking, you know, and like also just observing, doing the hike around the city and just like observing trash heaps and,
Mm-hmm.
you know, things that are dredged up from the river and things like that, sort of on the same scale.
Totally. Yeah, the dredge is how you try to figure out what's being repressed. Yeah.
Dredging it up and like, oh, I haven't seen that in 200 years. Weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, I mean, like, I love the idea that you're trying to just let nature run its course, or like outside of maybe human looking, like the way that's just become, like the painting in the back becomes this shimmering light, this dazzling, just perpetual recurring form, like you almost hear like a beat or a rhythm to that swirl that keeps happening. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that one in the back is very light-like, and it's sort of me. That one's named. It's the same name as the show, so it's Dancing in the Firmament, and it's it's referencing the firmament as the heavens and talking about light filtering through it and dancing and sort of roiling, and yeah, it's maybe more distilled motions than this one, but takes from the same area.
Also, I mean, like, I kind kind of want to pick up on what Sarah was saying earlier, like, because I like, Sarah, that you keep kind of coming back to the landscape as something you're not like actively really thinking about nature. It's just like a place to start, because once you start there, it's always about what you see in it. It's like a really obvious form of vision. And like, Chris, I mean, especially in that one, I just think about like the formal structure to it as a painter of like, there's like a real enjoyment of shifting those highlights to lowlights and low shadows and really shifting a color into various shades and tones and shadows. Like, but I feel like you also have something that you want to say or discover through the landscape. It's not totally like, this is just the clay, I need to find out something, but definitely you're using landscape to get really interesting, complex, like palette form and structure.
Yeah.
What's that relationship like, I guess, of like using the landscape versus like discovering it or like learning something from it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it starts with me with discovering it, right? And then I notice things about it, and I can kind of take from it, you know, as I want, and like, yeah, finding moments of like dappled light and like how does that affect like an imaginary scene where you're like confronted with a, you know, submersed monster under the water that's just this like intestinal root system in a lake. Yeah. I think I think I approach the ones that are like mediated a little bit more, obviously more formally and more I'm trying to figure out color sense and what that does to me psychologically and sort of experiencing it growing. Yeah.
But I mean, like, I know in some cases of your work, it's specifically something human generated affecting the land. Like, this is the iron getting into the rock is like a starting point. Like, how many of these are like maybe just seeing or sensing that there might be a picture in what you're looking at versus like a type of interest in like the horrible irony of like the geological time or the way like we are influencing the landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, like I said, I don't want to, I guess, be moralizing with it, but I think that I approach each scene differently, right? Like each moment, each experience, each one of these represents an experience, right? Like some sort of experience, either through a snapshot of like a literal, you know, image, whether it be analog or digital, or mediations through drawing and like doing color studies and doing pastels. So I don't know. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Well, I also wonder, maybe along those lines, and I don't know, also feel free, I just keep asking questions, but you both say like, I don't want to talk about that. You know, Chris, like, this is like, I associate it with like anti-style painting, where like there's a time being a painter in the aughts and like the teens where every painter did not want to have a singular style. Like, you wanted to be anti-capitalist when possible, you wanted to be able to like accommodate and change your seeing. It was postmodern. You weren't trying to say this is what I do and trademark it. You were trying to say like I'm changing with the thing. Sarah, I feel like you're trying to like keep yourself maybe locked into a more like a bracketed language that you're really trying to discover something through. But how do you, the question is leading up to, how do you think about that relationship to style in your work, or lack of style? Like, what's to be gained from repetition of it, and what's to be learned from keeping it open and expanded?
It's a great question. I mean, I think that I feel like a little baby in my painting, so I feel like I'm just getting used to them. So to change, I don't even feel like I figured out what I'm doing yet, but I think I'm interested in, like, I have like a bit more like technical classical training, and I like to just paint stuff like the way I saw it, but I'm not interested in making those pictures actually. So it's kind of balancing like getting to do the thing you want to do physically and to express the thoughts that you're having or whatever. So it's trying to meld, you know, how you like to paint with what you care about is kind of what I'm trying to get at. So I think that will change over time, and I don't think I've found the solution yet. So, but I like some sense of like recognizing what it is, but with the total freedom to do whatever I want. Also, so I'm trying to like have some sort of believability with control over the composition is where I'm coming at it.
Well, I think both of you could frame your work in terms of philosophy, but maybe you haven't found the answer yet, but it seems like you found the question, which is like the more important thing with it.
That's nice.
Yeah. And like seeing all the answers that can come out of that same question and coming to it. Chris, what about you? I feel like it's...
Yeah, I feel like with the work, I kind of want to keep it open, keep the style open, and it's obviously it jumps around a little bit from, or a lot of it from, you know, piece to piece. But I think that in that, I don't want to see my subject matter as a monolith, and I don't want to see myself as a monolith. You know, I want to keep it open and fresh, and I think that there might be a point where it does kind of, you know, focus or get towards something in a more methodical way, or however you want to put it. But I think for right now, I want to focus on like how does each individual experience or my want to create an experience make me feel.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question that I hope you both don't want to avoid, but I would understand if you did. Because let's go back to repression and that idea you don't want to create a monolith of yourself or the work. But I feel like in both of your practices, I feel like you're both incredibly opinionated people when it comes to what you like about what you're doing, and also have an idea of what you reject about what's being done maybe around you or in the world. And I'd be interested to think if there's a type of painting or an idea of nature that you're resisting. What don't you like? And name names. We're just being recorded.
We're just being recorded.
What don't you like?
I mean, I think
Utopia.
touchy.
You definitely
Very
brought up
touchy.
Utopia earlier
Yeah,
as
yeah.
a negative.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that, about like wanting to go against this certain vein of all art, but like especially some landscape painters who like the Hudson School, like Thomas Art Ben, like, you know, like I like moments about him. I know we might not have, but there's this sense of like right and wrong and good and evil and, you know, sort of just I don't know, bootstrappy ideology that I want to mix up in my own brain, as well as maybe others, but I don't want to go that far. But yeah, I don't know. I think going against utopia is like something that I'm into in that. Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
Speaking about your work, I really see that like anti-Western narrative of like right and wrong. Because first glance at these, it reminds me of like Miyazaki, like Eastern narratives where the characters are shifting alliances and you know there's not like a good character, bad character thing that is in every single Western you know narrative. And I really see like an acceptance in your work, which I love them. I
Thanks.
find them very comforting.
Hmm.
It's just like this, yes, it is messy out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I think maybe I'm trying to make myself feel better about that
they
too.
make me feel better too.
Yeah, in reproducing these things, or at least in an imaginative way, like making it okay that it's like there are no monoliths, there are no black and white anythings. Yeah.
I think that, I equally love that in both of your works, but like, I think, again, not utopic, not moralizing, but, I think of like Tala Madani's work. There's a really great Maggie Nelson essay on Tala Madani, where she talks about how Tala thinks of herself as a perpetrator and the perpetrated, and like the humiliation of violence that like none of us can stand outside of it and truly possess the victim. Like everyone is, by being here, by being a part of the history we're a part of, by being American, and all these different things, even when you want to resist what's being done to the environment, we're still humiliatingly implicated in it. And I think both of you don't try to step outside of that and say, look at what others are doing, but it's like, I'm part of this process in a way that really is disturbing to me, and trying to understand that humility, I guess, of approach. It's like really great.
Yeah.
So you didn't answer my question though.
Well, I went to New York Academy of Art, which I learned a ton. I took a lot from it, but I went in thinking I was gonna like do a lot of figurative stuff,
Yeah.
and it's a very figurative school, and immediately it was like no figures
Yeah.
ever again. So I think that, but impact of a figure
Yeah.
is there. So I think that maybe was a bit of the impetus. Part of, there's many things, but part of going into landscapes is like, how do I work around this? But I don't think that's really in it anymore. That was a reactionary time.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm not holding on to that.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll see some figures. I don't know.
Can't close it off. Yeah. Well, cool. I want to make sure, I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and also I'd imagine that the audience has questions for both of you too, and we could keep going. I could ask another hour's worth, but I'd like, does anyone have a question that you'd like to ask Chris and Sarah while we have them here? Yeah.
I really admire color in both of your work, and I was hoping you could speak more to that. If it's like from memory of being in the place, or if it's more emotion, or where you draw from that. Yeah.
I think for me, color, it oscillates with each piece a little bit, but I think that it is often the mediation of like my psychology and like, what's going on at the time, and how many times I do a drawing of something and I sort of like get it, how these colors make me feel. So I guess they're a little more symbolist in that way maybe, or like kind of, yeah. It differs though, but yeah. Colin?
I am trying, again, that thing of like an amount of believability plus doing whatever I want. So it's meeting in the middle somewhere, like, but again, things being hard to see means I have to kind of like have a very muted range or tight contrast. So it's hard to do whatever you want when you're making something hard to see. So, but I think color is like the most important thing to me in the work. That's when I see a color outside, that's the thing that's like most likely to get me to be like, oh, I have to go to the studio and try to mix that color. It almost never ends up in a painting, but that's like the biggest motivator.
Yeah, yours are like almost so obscure, like that, so subtle that they obscure, right?
Yeah.
For me.
I'm making it very difficult for myself to enjoy.
But those are like very beautiful moments where you're like the subtlety between like two very similar colors is just like, it's hard to capture. So I think you do that like super well.
I love your colors too.
Thanks. I'm a little more fanciful with mine, I guess. Yeah, and more
I think they're very sophisticated.
theatrical.
Mm.
I don't know. It depends.
Great question.
I have a question. I have a question about your use of black outlining. Because for me, that's sort of like the most abstracting part of your picture because like that's so not found in nature. So I wonder like, is that intentional? Does it just like come up through the painting process? And also on that, are you like building them up organically? Do they change a lot through the painting process or?
Yeah, they change a lot during the painting process. I mean, this one I hated for so long. And it, you know, over the months and months that I spent on it, it's just staring at me in my studio for a while. But yeah, some of them take like not as much time. Some of them take more. It's just depends on how much I messed it up the first go. But they're more organic and sort of the color decisions and the line work is more reactionary, I would say, as time goes on. And the black outlines, I think, it does like it almost cartoonizes or like sort of like animates them in an animation way. But I don't know, I think that's a way to, like we were talking about, kind of break apart things into fractals or like waves or these sort of swirling forms to better understand them, I guess. Yeah.
I have a question for Chris. So I've known your work for a while, and before maybe like a year ago, you were really making a lot of sculpture, maybe 2 years ago. And having the sculpture here as a reference point is nice for me to see them together. And I'm curious how switching into painting affected your work, especially because when I look at this, it almost brings up like fossils for me, or like something from the past, versus the paintings feel more present, almost like I like the Miyazaki reference, or like a snapshot of the wind, or something like fluid. And I'm curious if that's like because of oil paint, or more just like a chapter or season you're in now.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think how it's affected the sculpture and how the sculpture has affected the paintings is like a big part of why I wanted to, include everything that I'm doing at the time in this show. And I think for the sculpture, my sculptures that I was making before were a lot more colorful, and they're more like these like tie-dyed sort of, but rusty, relics and fossils, like you said. But I went more with silhouettes and colors, darker colors for these, because I wanted the paintings to kind of have the color and hold the color, and I wanted these to be almost shadows of what you might find in those worlds of the paintings. But yeah, I think that it's been an interesting sort of translation for me, because I've always been interested in painting, whether or not I would have admitted it at the time. And I've grown to love a lot of processes in that. So they both talk to each other, and I wanted to sneak some sculptures in here to sort of animate things around the viewer.
And your sculptures were very painterly also.
Yeah. They were very like, they started out as rectangles, the sculptures hanging on the wall or like in space, and they were, classic painting as sculpture, sculpture as painting, convo. But then they kind of like evolved into these like, reanimated, nature corpses.
I also think that's in your use of color too, with the paintings of, like a real interest in three-dimensionality from a two-dimensional surface, like really trying to almost chisel away at the frontness of each of these paintings, or the flat. It's like starting with the color and then trying to move it back in space and move it forward. Feels like you're working away at a still life of a head or something, or like something can spin, which is really nice.
Block of marble, just chiseling it out. Yeah,
they feel reductive in a really exciting way, of like starting with the natural color and then really trying to push it back, which is nice.
I've always liked artists who don't like to stick to their medium that they're best at, or like who kind of have fuzzy boundaries. Like I always like, filmmakers who are painters, and I like sculptors who are whatever. It's just like, I like to like focus on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a great Marcus Lupert's interview where he says that there's no difference between painting and sculpture, and there aren't painters and sculptors. Everyone's just an artist, but painters are better sculptors and sculptors are better painters, which I like. Totally disavowing what he said in the first half of the sentence. But yeah. But if there is something, painters are better sculptors. Yeah. Maybe one other question?
This is more going back to that anti-utopian ideal. Sarah, I can't help but feel in your paintings, like that hitches act as like deletions, like, or obscuring or hiding. And I think of Dutch painting, early Dutch landscape painting quite a bit with a low horizon and lots of sky as kind of a utopian representation of nature. And it seems like you want to hold on to that representation while also deleting it. So and Chris, I feel like maybe in the churning animatory gaze you have at this kind of what some people might consider refuse, I do think there's a utopian impulse there to pull something good out of something what most people might consider ugly. Do you feel like you both have a maybe more complex relationship to a utopian ideal that you want to hold on to?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that I grew up Christian, and so I believed that there was like I believed in eternity for my soul, and especially for the earth. Like I had this meta narrative that I believed in, and I don't have that anymore. So I think that both like utopia of my soul is something I'm seeking, but for the earth too, like just the idea that it was on purpose, that this is gonna work out. Yeah.
The universe is not guaranteed.
Yeah, but the Dutch landscapes very much have. I mean, I look at.
Yeah.
It's what I'm looking at.
It's
So.
But your handling of the reference is really gorgeous.
I mean, yeah, I think for me, whenever you're sort of against something or want to be mindful of it, you still look at it. I mean, you're like looking at these things, and I think, I think that the utopianness kind of comes off more in like the fractal or the churning or the sort of spiral. There's a lot of snail shells, casts of snail shells in the sculptures. I think it's there beneath the surface, but I think part of the painting and the sculpting and the drawing is like me trying to mix it up or like sort of like shake myself out of it. Like, come on, like, throwing different, experiences at it and trying to come up with something more complex than just like eternity or these other things.
Falling into easy belief or something.
Yeah, trying to, while still having those beliefs or like trying to go against them, make them more complex. Yeah.
There's a really great book, maybe someone here knows it, but it just came out like last year about Dutch landscape painting, and it was like a thesis of mud, that like mud is very important to Dutch landscape painting, and like the first half of the book is all these letters from like the French writing to the Dutch and being like, "Hi mud people, how you doing over there?" Because they couldn't build anything because there was swamps. And so the Dutch landscapes were constantly making these really gestural, quick paintings because buildings were falling over and falling into the mud, and the mud was constantly changing what they were painting, and they were trying to like find structure in an environment that was constantly changing underneath them, which I don't know. I think that's really interesting too, to maybe think of yes, Dutch landscape is this like picture that we find to be somewhat utopic, but is just muddy and changing and churning. And,
It's trying to grasp a snapshot at like, oh,
Yeah.
this is gonna be different
Yeah.
in like 5 years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or like even a year. Like
Even a year, yeah.
And the book had all these wonderful drawings that they would start to draw something and just be like, yeah, actually, it's not going to work anymore. It's different reality, which is, yeah.
Yeah, I think like more also animistic cultures tend to have these, be in these areas where things change a lot, right?
Yeah.
Like Japanese culture of being like prone to volcanoes and earthquakes and
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's part of it.
Thesis of roiling or a thesis of mud, thesis of
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you both so much. And
Thanks.